It's a few minutes after 6 now, and folks are still kind of trickling in, but we're going to go ahead and get started, and people can enter in when they do. But hello, everyone, and welcome to BARC's October edition of Ecology Club. My name is Michael Krokta, and I'm BARC's Forest Watch Coordinator. For those of you that might not be super familiar with BARC, we're a Portland-based nonprofit that focuses on defending and restoring forests surrounding Mount Hood. And so our topic this evening fits in really well with the restoration piece of that, which is the relationship between beaver habitat and wildfire. And to lead us in this discussion this evening is Emily Fairfax, who is with us tonight, who's an assistant professor of environmental science and resource management at California State University, Channel Islands. And Emily has been really involved with beaver research, but also outreach, which has been a really increasingly important part of the field of science and keeping it relevant with decision makers and funders and the general public. So really happy to have her here with us. And the reason, that the topic of beavers and wildfires came up at BARC relates back to a particularly smoky day, particularly smoky week back in Portland, back in September. I'm sure you all remember, when we were all sort of contemplating the fate of, the fate of a lot of things, but specifically these beaver-created wetlands that we've been studying out on the Clackamas drainage that are all within the perimeter of the Riverside fire. And it was that week I received Emily's latest paper, Smokey the Beaver, and thought, well, this is pretty interesting. And we live in some pretty sobering times, and folks are looking for solutions to this human crisis that the wildfires has created here, and for ways we can better coexist with wildfire in the future. And we already know that beavers can have such positive effects on ecosystems, so this is an especially exciting emerging topic that I'm really eager to learn about. And so before Emily gets started, I want to mention we also are planning on having Suzanne Foudy here with us today, who's a hydrologist who's also really deeply involved with beaver advocacy. And she's going to be sharing some of the latest developments in an effort that she's involved with to ban lethal beaver trapping on federal lands in Oregon. And so that's going to be after Emily's talk. And then just before I turn it over, I just want to remind people, if you could all just keep yourself muted during the presentations. And then if you do have questions, you can just put those at any time in the chat, and we're going to get to those during a couple of Q&As that we're going to do. So I think that's all I had to say. And Emily, why don't you just go ahead and take it away?
Great, thank you. So super excited to be here. Thank you for the invite. Thank you for having me. I am here to talk to you all about Smokey the Beaver. And before anybody messages me and says it's not Smokey the Beaver, it's Smokey Beaver, I've heard it before, I'm aware. I learned it as Smokey the Bear, and so that's why I went with Smokey the Beaver. I recognize that this is a contentious point, but it's not the point of my talk. The point of my talk is what Smokey the Beaver is actually doing. So many of us are probably a little bit more familiar with Smokey the Bear, right? He has this message that we have seen over and over and over again. It's all about preventing those fires. Only you can prevent forest fires. And so I was reading about Smokey the Bear, or Smokey Bear, and his posters were kind of intense. So it's our most shameful waste. Only you can stop this shameful waste. This shameful waste weakens America. And I was not super into that message, because not all fire is bad. And this message to me was really black and white. It was either you have fires and they're bad, or you don't have fires and that's good. And we're looking at these pictures of this big old bear holding these sad Bambis and pointing at the fire and shaming you. And I was like, Smokey the Bear, you are not resonating with modern forest management and fire management. Come on, Smokey. And I had been studying beavers already, and I had been studying them in the context of droughts. And what I was interested in previously was like, okay, if you've got lots of beavers in the landscape, can they help keep it greener during droughts? And it then kind of clicked in my head like, if it's staying green during droughts, maybe it would stay green during fires. And then what if instead of Smokey Bear, we had Smokey the Beaver? So we got Smokey Bear here. He's got his fire prevention focus. He is all about human intervention and behavioral modifications. And I don't know about y'all, but working in academia, when I need to convince people to change their behavior, that's hard. When I want to study a natural system or let earth processes do their thing, that's a lot easier. So any sort of fire management angle that we take that relies on human behavior is going to be a little tougher to get going, in my opinion. His message is also a bit outdated. He was very all or nothing, not about it. So Smokey Bear, you had your time. You did a lot of good for American forest fire fighting and everything back in the day, but it's time to re-envision Smokey as Smokey the Beaver. So Smokey the Beaver is all about fire moderation. It's not about stopping fires completely. It's about making sure that our fires are at an appropriate level, they're not too intense, they're not burning absolutely everything, and we're not getting these horrific gigafires that we're seeing this season, where millions of acres are burning very out of control. Another thing about Smokey Beaver that I was thinking was that Smokey the Beaver is working independently of humans. The way beavers can help us with wildfire has nothing to do with people. We don't have to deal with people. That definitely is going to make this an easier path forward. Smokey the Beaver is all about protecting these sensitive riparian ecosystems, protecting really important infrastructure without suppressing natural fire behavior. So we let the good fires happen, we let fire do its normal thing, but we aren't burning away critical habitat for endangered species. We aren't burning up the entire landscape to the point where there's not really a seed where it can come back from. So I'm more about this Smokey the Beaver wildfire moderation focus. And you may have noticed I haven't actually told you how beavers can fight wildfires yet. That's the whole point of this talk. I'm just giving you this little intro to it right now to get you jazzed about Smokey the Beaver before we dive on in. So how exactly are beavers protecting these riparian ecosystems during wildfire? And a riparian ecosystem, if you haven't heard that term before, it's just sort of the area that's very close to rivers and streams and creeks, where the plants are all sort of reliant on that water source to be happy and healthy. So beavers are doing it because they have all these landscape modification behaviors. They are chewing down trees, which is changing the fuel structure in the landscapes. They are building dams, which are creating these really big ponds, which are essentially little micro reservoirs scattered around. They're digging channels, which is extremely important for spreading that water out in the landscape and acting sort of like a drip irrigation system for all those plants all around these beaver ponds. So they're sort of keeping everything happy and healthy and green by chewing trees, building dams, making ponds, and digging channels. If you were to walk up to a beaver pond, this is something like what you'd see. Unfortunately, you don't get that really sweet like cut-in view that you get in these scientific diagrams, but you'd see something like this. So we've got some beavers in the landscape, got some beavers swimming around. This structure here is the beaver's lodge. It's sort of like a mound of sticks where, I mean, that really is what it is. It's a mound of sticks packed with mud that the beavers go in and they chew these little entrances and chew out little chambers so that they can live in a hut in the middle of the lake or in the middle of the pond or sometimes on the banks. This is separate from the dam. So beavers do not live in the dam. That is a common misconception. If you've heard that, it's okay. A lot of people think that, but it is not true. The dam is only there to create a pond. And if you're thinking, why are the beavers going through so much effort to create this pond? Like, what's the point? I would like you to think about what a beaver might look like on land. So they are round. They are kind of gelatinous in body physique. And so when they are walking out in the landscape looking for some food, looking for trees to chew down, it's like a big old chicken nugget walking around the landscape. If you're a mountain lion, if you're a bear, if you're wolves, like these are high fat, high protein animals that would be excellent prey. But as soon as you put that beaver in the water, it is so slick and agile, it's basically invincible. A beaver in the water is super safe. a beaver out on the land is extremely vulnerable. And so the beavers, they've recognized this over their millions of years of evolution and have evolved so that they build these dams to make these ponds to essentially be a big defense moat. And then this channel digging behavior they have, in the back here, you can kind of see a channel spreading out into the landscape. That's so that when the beavers want to come back and reach these trees in the background, they don't have to walk over land and then try to drag a whole tree back over land. That's not going to fly. What they do is they dig out these little channels, and then those channels then are like little water highways. And so the water, it spreads out, which is super great for the plants. The beavers aren't thinking about the plants. The beavers are thinking about having a speedy route back to the pond if a predator shows up. They're also thinking about getting those trees that they need to build the lodge and the dam back all the way to the pond. Beavers are strong. They're definitely big. A beaver is anywhere from 40 to 100 pounds. So these are not trivially sized animals, but it is not easy to drag a tree over land, no matter how big you are. So what the beavers do is they put it in these little channels, and then the natural buoyancy of the tree lets it float, and they can float it right back to their pond. So they're all about efficiency, which is awesome. If you're out in the wild, walking around looking for beavers, the first sign you'd see is probably chewed trees. And so beavers have this really characteristic way of cutting trees. So they stick their little snouts in there and they scrape away, and you can really see the scrape marks where they've been cutting, and that's from their teeth. So if you're ever trying to figure out if a place has beavers or not, and you see a fallen tree, you want to look for those scrapes. Sometimes they don't go all the way through the tree. So these are some downed trees where they've just sort of started snacking, just tried to cut it up, but they're not quite done yet. Classic beaver sign. Sometimes they get all the way through. We see them doing this chewing activity everywhere. Beavers like to eat the bark and the layer between the bark and the wood on trees. It's very sugary. And so they scrape it off and feast on it, even if they're not going to be doing a lot of building. So you definitely see this if you're looking for beavers out in the wild. When they get all those sticks together, this is what the dams actually look like in the wild. They are all sorts of different shapes and sizes. They can be really tall, really small, really long, really short. They'll have varying amounts of wood and stone and mud all packed into them. But the goal, as you can see here, is to have a bunch of water in the pond and then just a trickle of water coming downstream. It is important to note, beaver ponds are not like human-made reservoirs, in that they are very, very leaky. And so even a really well-built beaver dam is going to be leaking water through constantly. Human-made dams, they are made to not leak unless we want them to leak. And so these are actually functioning really differently in the landscape compared to our human-built reservoirs and human-built retention ponds. So this is a fairly small beaver dam. This one was maybe 3 feet tall. Pretty average. Average beaver dams just under 1 meter tall. They can be a lot bigger though. So this is a not average beaver dam. This is a big old beaver dam. This is me for scale. I'm 5.5 feet tall. This dam, I'm on the bank actually. It's a little deep down here in the scour pool. The dam is 8 feet tall. So this is a really big beaver dam. They are industrious. They can make some huge ponds. And that's a really big deal because those huge dams are storing a huge amount of water. And then they spread that water out. So when you're out in the field and you see these little sort of ditches just radiating out from a beaver pond or radiating out from a river, that's the beavers. They're digging. They're going in like little shovel hands, digging the mud out, repurposing that mud to pack into their dams, to pack into the lodge, and then they make these little flooded water highways or drip irrigation systems throughout the landscape. All sorts of animals love this. The beavers are doing it selfishly. They do it to make themselves safe from predators and to have a happy, easy life. But moose love it, turtles love it, fish love it, bears love it. Everybody loves it because everybody loves to have clean water that's there all the time, that does not dry up in the summertime, and this really complex, messy habitat where there's a variety of, cool spots and sunny spots and shady spots and hot spots and fast flowing water mixed with slow flowing water. They're completely modifying the landscape. They can even sort of revive the landscape. And so some of the coolest things that we see beavers doing is moving into these arid or drier places throughout the American West. Pretty nasty streams, having a hard time. They've either been overgrazed by cattle or by elk or something like that. They're just cutting down and it's not a good thing. But then the beavers move in And by building this dam and making this pond and digging these channels, they can bring back these landscapes to a much healthier, much more natural state. And this truly does happen at the landscape scale. So this is a satellite image with a ton of beaver dams in it. And if you don't look at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of beaver dams and satellite images, one, I recommend it. Two, I'm happy to explain what you're looking at. So this is about 100 meters on my scale bar down here. So this is a pretty big area. And now you can see all of the different beaver modifications mapped out. So in yellow, we have the beaver dams themselves. So there's lots of dams here. They've dammed up the main channel of this river, and they have also dammed up a side channel of this river. When they do that, they just keep spreading that riparian zone out. They keep making this wetland bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, they got to get around in their wetland without getting picked off by predators, so they dug all these little channels, which are highlighted in this light blue color. And so all these little channels spreading that water out in the landscape. And then the beavers are just living here in this lodge, enjoying their moat, enjoying their lives, and as a byproduct of their natural behavior, are creating these incredibly complex, wet landscapes. And that water storage, that wetness, is really, really key for fighting fires. That's where the beaver's ability to be Smokey the Beaver really comes from. It's this water storage. They're storing it in the ponds, they're storing it in the channels, they're storing it in the ground, in the soil, in the plants. The whole landscape, from root all the way up to leaf tip, is wet. And this has consequences. So this is a picture of Idaho. This is from the Sharps fire. This is a photograph that Joe Wheaton took. He's another beaver researcher. And he went out there with his drone after this fire burned. And we've got the burn scar over here. And he went to see some beaver dams he'd been looking at. And they were just bright green, unburned, totally fine. And everything around them was charred. And if you look up into this picture towards the background, here's the area with beavers, nice and bright and green. You go a little further down where there aren't any beavers and it is burned. So this is not a case of the fire couldn't burn through the river. It did burn through the river. This is a case of the fire couldn't burn through the beaver ponds, which is really kind of a remarkable difference. You would expect big rivers to be difficult for a fire to get through, and in general they are. But with these really intense fires we're seeing, just a river isn't enough. You need a river and you need a really big green riparian zone all around it, well watered, not drought stressed. So if we looked down into the earth at a stream that has beavers and a stream that does not have beavers, here's the one without beavers, and then over here is the one with beavers. So we've got lots of plants chilling up on the surface, and we have some infiltrating precipitation. So we got rain or snow or whatever is coming down, it's trickling into the soil. All the plant roots can reach it. This is just like if you sprinkle your lawn, exact same thing's happening. The stream and the beaver pond are both having impacts on the groundwater system. And then we've got a deep water table. So that means if you wanted to get to natural groundwater, you'd have to dig pretty far down, which is common in the West. It's pretty deep in these dry places. So this is during a normal time, right? We got precipitation, all the plants are fine, natural, happy, whatever. We've got a lot more sort of groundwater impact over here, but it doesn't matter yet. All the plants are fine. We've got the beaver pond, we've got these little nuggets for the beaver channels kind of winding through the landscape, but in both scenarios, the plants are green. When that changes is when we enter drought conditions. So as soon as we enter a drought, as soon as we take away this precipitation that's coming in, we stop the rain, we stop the snow, then all these plants that can't reach the groundwater with their roots are going to start to wilt. So they're going to start to go that kind of yellowish brown color. They're going to get dry and crinkly. They're going to turn into kindling. They are going to get very easy to burn. When you're thinking about a landscape's fire risk, you have to think about both the amount of vegetation there is and how dry that vegetation is. Low soil moisture and low plant moisture are really strong predictors of intense fire behavior. And so when all you have is this little stream trying to beef up that water table, it's not enough. You get this really narrow riparian corridor. It's not very wide. The fire can just cruise right on through it. In the beaver dammed area, however, because we've got these little drip irrigator channels, because we were storing so much more water in the soil in the first place, the plants are pretty good. There might be a couple that are having a harder time reaching, but in general, the plants are able to access groundwater because the beavers have been storing it and they continue to store it in the ponds. And so as you continue into this sort of drought state, that pond can keep leaching into the soil. And then imagine we get a lightning strike or one careless match or, you know, a downed power line like we see a lot in California. Any of these fire ignition events, and suddenly all your dried up vegetation is very likely to burn. It's super easy to catch fire. In this non-beaver dammed area, we see the fire just roaring through this landscape. It burns everything that's wilted, so much is wilted, it causes a lot of destruction. In the area with beavers though, only maybe the fringes burn. The fire will try to come in from either side, but it's gonna have a hard time when it hits that wet vegetation. If you've ever tried to start a campfire, then you're out scavenging for tinder and kindling and logs, you are not gonna go to the wettest leaf pile you can find and pick up all those soggy leaves. That's the terrible way to start a fire. You'd go try to find dry stuff. And that exact concept is here in the beaver pond areas. All those plants are very wet, and so they're very hard to burn. So this is sort of my technical, intense, lots of diagram making conceptual model, but I also made a conceptual model that I thought would be a little easier to communicate to a broader audience. And so some of you may have seen this conceptual model before, but it is a just a little short snippet, 45 seconds, of this process that I just walked you through here. And so hopefully you'll enjoy this as much as I enjoyed making it. This is what I was imagining in my head during this entire research project. He's okay, yay, that's great. Smokey the beaver has protected his landscape. The fire still came through, we didn't completely stop the fire, but everything in this wetland was okay. We could hear birds in this video, we could hear animals, we could hear the water flowing, and that's kind of what I was sort of interested in. So if we're creating these patches that aren't burning, then those patches could act as a refuge for animals that can't get out of the fire. When we've got fire spreading really far, animals are gonna try to find somewhere cool and shaded and not burning to hang out. They can't outrun the flames. And so historically in the West, we had tons of wetlands and we have obliterated most of them. We're down to like somewhere between 60 and 90% wetland loss, depending on where you are in the West. And historically, when you had fires, it was probably a lot easier to find one of these patches that didn't burn. But now that we don't have those wetlands, when a fire erupts, things like fish and frogs and small birds and small mammals, they're gonna have a really hard time finding shelter. And so what they do, or they can do, is come to a beaver pond. It's not gonna burn, it's gonna stay green. They can hunker down, wait it out. When the fire has subsided or moved on, then they can spread back out into the landscape and recolonize. So I had this idea, which is great, but you actually have to prove your ideas before anybody really believes you or takes you seriously. So to do that, I actually needed to observe and measure this fireproofing around the beaver dams. I'd seen these great photographs, I had come up with my conceptual model, but I needed to see that this actually happens. So the first thing I did was I downloaded all the fire perimeters in the entire Western USA for the last decade onto my computer. And I crashed my computer so many times. We've had a lot of fires. So I then pared it down based on really, I was looking for these kind of big, intense fires, large burn areas that I knew were within the range of beaver habitat. So I started kind of focusing in on places where I knew there were some beavers. I knew we had some really big burn scars. I was looking at larger fires. And then I went through and I mapped out every single beaver dam in these burn scars, and it wound up being about 1,500 beaver dams in my study. So I'm like zooming in these satellite images and I'm tracing out these little beaver dams and I'm looking for all these beaver channels to see where they start and stop. And then based on where these beavers are, I can take a satellite called Landsat, and it is taking pictures basically of the plant's health every couple weeks. It takes a picture of plant health. So I'm going through in these fire burn scars, and I'm going back and picking the plant health before, during, and after the fire. And so then I can look at it and see in the areas with beavers, did it look different than the areas without beavers? Putting that all together, I can really see if beaver damming had an effect on how green and healthy and happy vegetation actually was. So methods are boring. Let's talk about the results. This is the cool part. So how big of an impact did they have? What did we see? So I looked at 5 different fires in my study, ranging from about 38,000 acres up to just under 400,000 acres, which was a remarkably large fire until this year when we've had this gigafire happening. And they burned sometime between 2000 and 2019. Those were the range of years I looked at. It was California, Colorado, Idaho, Wyoming, and Oregon. And I tried to make sure that these fires represented a variety of different burn conditions and topographies and sort of forest versus shrubland versus grassland, etc. I wanted to see that this happens everywhere. I'm sure that you can find a rare instance of pretty much any environmental phenomena happening. That's not what I was interested in. I wanted to see, is this something that beavers consistently do in the landscape? So I'm going to talk about the Manter fire in California because I have the coolest photo from it, so it totally has changed the direction of this talk. So the Manter fire was a big fire that happened in the Domeland Wilderness, which is part of Sequoia National Forest. It burned in the summer of 2000, and it consumed about 79,000 acres. There are definitely a lot of beavers up here, and they've been up here for a very long time, and they're still here now. This is me standing by a beaver dam in the middle of fall, or I guess close to winter of last year. Yeah, this was like November. And then there's me looking in some of these brushes, and as you get closer to the beaver pond, you can actually see some more of these plants are staying green. A lot of this is willow that dropped its leaves, so the sort of brownness you're seeing is not wilted plants, it's just plants that are dropping their leaves. This is what it looks like in satellite images. This area is super cool. This beaver lodge here is 60 feet across. This is like the size of an apartment. So these beavers are industrious. They're creating really large wetlands in an otherwise extremely dry and rocky area. Seems like a cool case study. So this is sort of what the satellite data that I look at looks like. What we're looking at is NDVI, which is the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which is just how green are the plants. And I've scaled it from red to blue. So red means your plants are dead or absent. Blue means they're super, super lush. You only usually see blue in areas that are both heavily vegetated and have lots of really happy plants. So river corridors are often blue. So this is the whole Manter burns area. This is before the fire, it's not burned. It's just not a very lush area. There's not a lot of plants up here. And I've zoomed in a little bit on this central part, which is where the river runs through. You can see on this zoom in, we do get a few patches of blue, a few patches of these like really green spots before the fire, and then the fire comes. When the fire comes, it burns a lot. Pretty much everything within this fire scar has gone red, meaning the plants are now absent or dead. They've burned. You can even see the smoke plume still up here. So these images are from like during the fire. There's not been time for a rebound yet. And if you look in on the river again, red laser pointer is not the color to use on these maps. You can see some blue patches on there still. So there are some parts of the river that are doing okay. Now, I haven't told you where the beavers are yet. That's important. Afterwards, it springs back. The river's fine. This is pretty classic behavior in riparian zones. The river has developed plants that are used to being disturbed. They deal with floods, they deal with droughts, they deal with fires. Riparian plants are good at springing back. That's not really what I'm as interested in. I want to see if they can stay green during the fire, because that habitat is what I want to see. Is that habitat persisting, or is it being obliterated? So now I'm going to show you where the beavers are. So I've zoomed in on the river, you can see it over here, and then marked in little white circles are all the beaver dams. And so I'm going to start with a zoom in, an extra zoom in, of this branch of the stream right here. We've got a big cluster of beaver dams, and then not very many more. So before the fire, I've sort of drawn a little box around where the beavers are to remind you. If I put all those circles on again, you wouldn't be able to see anything. The river's all doing okay. It's all a little bit this brighter color, but where the beavers are is definitely blue, so it is definitely greener where they were. Then the fire comes and it burns straight through the river here. But down where these beavers are, it didn't burn. And if you zoom in super close and have a really high resolution monitor, you can see that there's actually a couple of blue pixels in here. So it did stay very green in this area with beavers. And afterwards, the river springs back, as rivers are wont to do. If we zoom in on this other branch, it's interesting. We've got two patches of beavers now with a section in between, no beavers. Before the fire, everything's blue, but actually this section without the beavers is bluer. So we had some really, really healthy, great looking riparian zone before the fire happened. This is awesome, great. Maybe that's gonna make it too. Maybe it's just you need to have a lot of sort of greenness and it doesn't matter if all these beaver modifications are happening or not, right? Wrong. Fire came right through, burned the middle again. And so these areas with beavers, they stayed blue, but even this area that was looking like it was doing all right in the year before, it wound up burning. And I think my hypothesis here is because it didn't have that stored water. So as soon as those drought conditions started, those plants were prone to wilt faster. And so all you need is a couple weeks of drought to really get those plants from happy and healthy to not doing so great. And then after it starts springing back again, as these places are often doing. So how I actually took the data is I had a starting point on each creek and then a stopping point. And I sort of picked these areas based on where is the creek pretty similar for that whole stretch. It doesn't like dramatically change shape or landscape form or anything like that. And then imagine that you're like walking along the river and you're taking notes of how green it is. So that's what I was doing, except instead of actually walking along these rivers in the year 2000, when I was not a scientist, I was going back in satellite images from the year 2000 and walking along the rivers in my satellite images and seeing how green are these places. And this is what I saw. So in this plot, what we have on our x-axis here is the distance along creek. So imagine like start is over here and then stop is over here. On our y-axis is that NDVI, which again is just how green are the plants. Higher number, plants are greener. Lower number, plants are not as green. The years before and after the fire are shown in these green colors, and then the year of the fire, so during it while it was burning, is shown in this brownish color. And you can see it's pretty spiky. That's pretty normal. You get patches of veg, patches of not veg. But it does drop pretty dramatically during the fire. So we're cruising along, it looks okay, and then it just plummets as we're going down the creek. And then marked down here on this x-axis in black boxes are the beaver dams. And so as soon as we get out of this beaver dammed area, the NDVI drops. We see the plants burning. What I've marked with this dashed yellow line here is an NDVI of 0.3, and anything below 0.3 is considered to be not great for a riparian zone. That means the plants are not there, they're burning, they're very wilted, they're not healthy. And so as soon as we get out of that beaver dammed area during the fire, plants are not doing so okay. An easier way to visualize this is to look at the difference between the pre-post average, so when we don't have a fire, versus the fire years. Bigger number means we're being more affected by the fire. As soon as we get out of that beaver dammed area, it shoots right up. So we really get affected by the fire when there's no beaver dams, very little impact from the fire when we do have beaver dams. And I saw this and I was like, wow, this is awesome. I wonder if this happened everywhere. And it did happen everywhere. And don't pretend like you can read any of these little plots because they are impossible to read when they're this small. And so my next task was to figure out a way to show that this happened everywhere without showing a billion of these tiny little plots. So I needed a way to sort of aggregate my data. All of these different creeks, they're different landscapes, they're different forest covers, they're different everything. So how do I get them to all relate to one another? There is a better way to do this. So what I did was I needed to scale it. So I went on every creek. First thing I did was I looked at and broke it into these pieces, places where it was beaver impacted, so it was by beaver dam or by beaver channel, and then places where it was not beaver impacted, where we didn't have any beaver activity in that section. Then I found the maximum difference on every creek. So on Creek A, the most difference we saw was 0.2, right? And so then every point on Creek A is going to be scaled by that value. So we're sort of normalizing it. So saying like, okay, well, this creek was extremely burned. So given that it was extremely burned, how did the beaver areas fare compared to the non-beaver areas? get a version of that so I can compare it to this other creek. So we're always sort of scaling it to how much that individual creek was affected. You can basically think about this as the percent of max vegetation burning that actually happened. So how much did it actually burn on this creek? And this is a much easier way to see that this was a consistent phenomena. So we have some box plots here showing the scale differences from all the creeks put together, every single pixel of data that I looked at. And in yellow, again, is no beavers. And then in blue is beavers. And the higher up we are on this chart, that is more impact from the fire. And so the average scaled difference was 0.58 in the area without beavers. So that means you take the most burned pixel on a creek, so the places that got charred the most. On average, all of the places that didn't have beavers were burning about 60% of that. So that's pretty intense burning. Like I'm finding the worst spot on the whole creek, and all these places without beavers are burning more than half of that. Compare that to the places with beavers, they're only burning 0.19, so 19% or about 20% of that. And so the difference here is about 3 times. So the places that do not have beavers are burning about 3 times more than the places that do have beavers. And these are statistically significant differences. I ran all these stats tests to make sure what I was observing was true and real and not just sort of a farce of the data. And it is true, these are definitely different behaviors. So in the landscape, if you've got beavers on one stretch of the creek and then you don't have beavers anymore, that section without beavers is going to get burned 3 times more. That is a big factor of difference. And I did see this. So this is a picture from the Manter fire that was actually taken by the burned area emergency response team right afterwards. A fun fact about outreach is that if you talk about it enough, you meet some really cool people that have cool experiences. So I was actually talking about Smokey the beaver and I didn't have this photo. And this guy, he tuned into my talk and then he emailed me and he was like, I was on the response team for that. I have some cool photos to share with you. And I was like, no, you don't, you're joking. Like, what are the odds that you were on for that fire? And he did, and he had them. And you can see the beaver dams, and this is incredible. I mean, we've got an undammed section of creek right here, and then a section that's got these beaver dams on it. It's scorched. I mean, this tree is burned to the tip. It is an intense burn. The soil is scorched. Like, this fire is no joke. And then it comes over and you can see it burning the soil, trying to get into this area, and it fizzles the edges, and then it's too much. It's too wet, it can't make it, it's energetically unfavorable to keep burning that way. So the fire's got no choice but to stop or go a different direction. And so these beaver dams, just like I saw in my satellite data, they stopped the fire from burning up the whole riparian zone. This was incredible. Like, I literally was calling everybody I knew when I saw this and texting them this photo. And I was like, did you see this? Look at this. This is amazing. These beavers are so cool. And then once I'd seen this photo and I kind of knew what I was looking for in terms of visuals, I started scrolling through Google Earth and I was like, I've got to see if this has happened anywhere else. And like, the satellites just happened to be flying at the right time. And I actually found it for the Oregon fire I studied, which was really cool. I was looking at the Buzzard complex and I'm cruising along these creeks, and I've got this creek running through, pretty shrubby landscape, not super dramatic. Got a little beaver pond right in here. And then I had an image that was taken right after the fire burned. So it was like perfect timing. Thank you, Google Satellites. I appreciate you doing this back in like 2013 or whatever it was. And you can see the beaver pond, and you can even see his little lodge in there. They're fine. It's all green, except over here where there weren't beavers. It's no longer green, rough over there. But this stayed green. Everything else is burned. And so it's happening. It's happening everywhere. My satellite data is showing me that this is not an isolated phenomenon. My photographs from people I meet over the internet after doing outreach is showing me that this is not an isolated phenomenon. And now I'm going in the satellite images again, looking back, and I'm seeing it is not isolated. Beaver dams and beaver activity is really keeping these patches green, even during fire. Doesn't matter if it's a forest fire, doesn't matter if it's a shrub fire or grass fire, I've seen it. I'm really curious to keep testing it more and more to see, like, is there a limit? Did they stop? Like, what about Arctic fires? What about, super desert fires? What about the gigafire? I'm sure that there's beaver dams up there. And so I'm very excited about this. This project is not over. There's a lot more to do, but everything I've seen so far is really encouraging that beavers could be a really effective strategy. And so that's really my take-home messages for you. these beaver dammed areas, they're storing this water in the soil, in the plants, in the ponds. It's just these big, soggy, spongy spots in the landscape. It's wet. It's not going to burn. Water doesn't burn. And the vegetation around them, it's not burning in the satellite data. We're seeing it not burn as much. It's burning 3 times less. And so if you think about this from a land management perspective, beaver damming, it's low cost. I mean, you don't pay beavers. They need food and they need to be left alone. And then it's a systematic way, so they're already spreading out throughout the landscape. We don't have to necessarily go in and sort of plan where we're putting them. They're already out there. And they're not stopping the fires altogether, but they are moderating that habitat damage. They're keeping patches of habitat okay during wildfire. There is some evidence that they may, in certain cases, sort of stop fire from going in specific directions. But from what I've seen so far, that's really dependent on the specific fire. So if your fire is way up in the tree crowns and you got high winds, like it's just gonna blow over beaver dams. It's not gonna stop it altogether. But in some of my little brushier fires, we did see the fire kind of come up to an edge and then get stuck and have to change directions and go a different way. So that's also an active area of research. I don't know if that's widespread or if that's a, one time it happened and it was cool kind of thing. But it's exciting. I think that there's a lot of promise for beavers, a lot of promise for Smokey the beaver to really be our new fire mascot and help us manage these fires a little bit more carefully and a little bit less invasively. We don't need to be controlling the landscape ourselves 100%. We can kind of let these natural processes do their thing. So I'm happy to take questions about this specific part of the talk. I believe we're going to do some more broad Q&A at the end, but if there's stuff about this, go ahead and hit me with it.
All right, thanks, Emily. That just got me super excited. It looks like some other people, based on what they put in the chat, got pretty excited too. I'm just gonna read a couple questions here that people typed in, and definitely feel free to type in any questions you have at any point here. We're gonna have like a first Q&A now before we get Suzanne on the line, and then we're gonna do a second Q&A too. So if you have a question you want to hold till later, or you think of something at any point, that's really cool. So the first question here, has there been any interest from government agencies partnering on projects like this yet?
I've seen some interest. It tends to be pretty localized. Like if you get one person with the Forest Service who's really into beavers, a lot of times it's easier to get your traction going on beaver dam analogs, which are when people try to build beaver dams, do a kind of crappy job of it. But beavers love to fix up beaver dam analogs, so it's a kind of a roundabout way to get beavers to move into a site. So I've seen people sort of turn towards these BDAs to encourage this process to start, but it's very new, and I haven't seen a huge amount of like action happening yet. A lot of conversations, but not a lot of action yet.
Great. Okay, so next question here. Do you think that the degree to which beaver created / maintained sites act as fire refugia changes depending on the regional climate surrounding ecosystem types? So for example, drier forest or sage steppe areas versus temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, so I definitely think it's going to change. Based on how I think this process is working, it's really reliant on the beavers being responsible for keeping water in the soil when the soil would otherwise be dry. And so if you're somewhere where you've got really deep-rooted plants that can reach into the groundwater even if it's fallen, then I don't think you're going to see quite as much of a beaver effect in the landscape. But I did see this happening across shrubs, forests, and grasslands, and it was pretty, big pine forests. They weren't temperate rainforests, but if you've got drought-stressed vegetation and the beavers are watering the plants, then I think you'll see the beaver effect.
Another question here, and this is actually a very similar question to one I had. Many of the beaver impacted sites that we've been visiting in Mount Hood are isolated wetlands or wetlands at headwaters of streams rather than within stream floodplains, kind of more channelized. While some of these have really strong groundwater influence, many draw down the surface soils, but without standing water by late August. So they dry up later in the year, later in the summer. And so this person is wondering if Emily has observed these kinds of sites act as barriers to fire?
So in the sites that I studied, We did include broken beaver dams and not super well maintained beaver dams as the beaver areas. They were beaver impacted still. We saw some of this in Colorado in that fire. There were just tons of beaver dams. And a lot of them looked like they were mostly dried up, or they'd mostly sort of washed out. We still saw the effect. It's more prominent when you have the active beaver dam. But actually, one of the photos that I got from this like magical man from the Manter fire was a broken beaver dam. It was totally empty, and all around it was still green. And so that photo makes me think that it's possible. I don't know if it's more of sort of an isolated thing where you have to have the perfect storm of like soil conductivity and when did it dry out? Like, has it been dry for 6 months? Did it just dry out 2 weeks ago? I think that's going to be a little bit more case by case specific, but it's possible.
Interesting. Questions leading to more questions. So let's see. Have you compared rivers and streams with beaver dams on them compared to none at all?
So in my study, it was all the comparisons were within streams that had both. But in the Wyoming fire, there were places where there was like 2 or 3 beaver dams and then a huge section without beaver dams, like kilometers long. And so one of the questions I get a lot is about, how far downstream do these effects propagate? And I've seen it mostly going a few hundred meters maximum past the end of beaver activity. In my study, I cut it off. It had to be within 30 meters of beaver activity to be classed as like a beaver pixel. And that did capture sort of the limit of how far that happened. You can see it in the fire picture too from the Manter fire. Like the fire does come up right to the stream. And so it's not like they're keeping miles and miles and miles green. They're keeping a somewhat narrow band green.
Okay, so yeah, I have a question. I don't know if you'd be able to answer this or not, but do you have any sense of sort of over the long term, do beavers continue to use these sites that you're looking at kind of over time? Or I'm kind of imagining maybe there might be a cycle that occurs where, new growth is promoted elsewhere and they move on and possibly more habitat is created over a course of time by the fire. Is that something that you've observed or would expect?
I mean, I have definitely observed that since these fires burned, the dams are still there. And like when I went up into the California site and hiked around all the dams that I had marked from the year 2000, many of them were still there today. And so those dams, it's very possible the beavers left and then came back and then left and then came back, because that's what beavers do anyways. They move back and forth in the landscape on the order of 1 year to 7 years, sort of finding prime food. But they love to recolonize a site. Once they've decided it's a good site, like it's a good site until something really dramatic pushes them out. And apparently fire is not dramatic enough because they're still there.
How long did it take you to make that stop motion video?
So if you include the time I spent just thinking about it, like sitting there trying to think about it, a long time. If you're just talking about creating it, it was pretty short actually. It was like 4 hours. On my kitchen table with a cork board and some old plastic plants on push pins and felt that I sewed because I was a Girl Scout and I learned how to sew felt, and a little beaver toy. And I just downloaded an app on my phone that was called like Make Stop Motions or something. And I was like, all right, here we go. And I pointed a lamp at it and I started clicking the buttons to make it take the photos. And like 300 photos later, I had a stop motion.
Wow. Okay, well, I'm gonna have to check out that app because that's a really great communication tool and a great way to explain how some of these processes work in a different way, where you can reach a lot more people. It's super cool.
I wish I'd known it was going to be so popular, because I've had people be like, "Can you give me a higher resolution version of it?" And I'm like, "Yo, it doesn't exist. Like, this is what it is."
Oh. Yeah. Any other videos in the works?
Yeah, I've bought the felt for the next one. I'm pretty excited about it. I'm going to be looking at sort of a different spin on how beavers help modulate environmental extremes, but the exact topic is a secret still.
Okay, so stay tuned, everyone, for that. Great. Well, it looks like we've kind of tapered off on questions for now. I think that now might be a good time to see if Suzanne is on the line. Suzanne, are you with us? I saw your name pop up earlier.
How do I show up?
Oh, Suzanne's here. Okay, so yeah, we wanna just introduce Suzanne. Suzanne's a hydrologist who's really been leading the charge in the efforts to ban lethal beaver trapping on federal lands here in Oregon, which obviously is super relatable to the conversation we've been having here, very relevant. And yeah, we wanted to have Suzanne here to give an update on sort of how those efforts have been going and some, if you have any next steps to share. So thanks Suzanne for being with us, and take it away.
You bet. Hey, Emily, great talk again. It's always fun to learn something more.
Thank you.
And I wanted to touch base on just a couple of things near the end that were in response to questions that Emily got that I thought might be helpful before I go into the petition. It's interesting because beaver trapping is the wild card. So whenever anybody says, well, the beaver left, unless your state does not have beaver trapping, you must consider that a possibility. So it may be that beavers return, but actually it's a whole new set of beavers that finally make it into the area. And that, so when we oftentimes hear this over the years, well, they used the site and then they left, nobody's ever really considered the effect that beaver trapping has on how frequently they leave. And I believe California just banned all trapping as of last year. Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was last year that California took the big step to just ban trapping. So that includes beaver trapping as well. So I just thought that was one thing that's really important, and that's this, and that leads in really well to another point that was made, which is why Emily's talk is just so relevant, and that had to do with are the agencies clamoring now about beavers? And the answer, unfortunately, as Emily sort of really captured well, it depends on whether or not you've got somebody really excited. But the Forest Service's focus is fire and timber. That's what they care about. And even when I was still working for the Forest Service, and I would be, this is sort of pre-Emily's magic, and I would be like, hey, if I went and got money for you fire guys, could I get you to cut the encroaching conifers in meadows? And let's just create a bunch of debris jams, because right now we don't have beavers, but let's get those meadows wet. And they're like, yeah, maybe. So there really isn't, unfortunately, that interest. But I think that what Emily's talk has done is really given this visual that has been missing. So it's like a lot of us who've been doing beaver recognize the value of wetlands, but without that incredible visual and that really solid quantitative analysis, you can talk all you want, but it just is a much harder discussion. And that's why, that's one of the beauties and the excitements that's around what she's done is she's quantified it. She's really started to look at it. There's these amazing photos, this amazing analysis that's incredibly robust. And an agency that focuses on fire, hopefully, and I understand there is actually some significant interest at the Regional Forester's Office in Region 6, that they may be much more inclined. Now, this leads into the petition. So currently, as you guys all know, we can trap beavers in Oregon, except in a very few places. And so where we stand right now is we went in June, we made a request. There was some very sketchy things that ODF&W did. We weren't able to get the commissioners to make a vote on our petition, which was to close essentially 30 million acres of public land, federally managed public land in the state. And so the next step was this formal petition. And it's a much more involved request. We have to make sure that we address all the statutes. So the commissioners got that on September 24th. It is an extensive document. It draws a lot on what we gave them in June, but it also adds a lot more because during the time that ODF&W was presenting their reasons why trapping was not a big deal, they said, you know, there's no habitat. They need 18 acres of willows. A colony needs 18 acres of willows per year for a colony of 6. And they kept saying that. And then it was like, it's not trapping. There's no documentation that it's trapping. Trapping doesn't affect populations. And so in our petition, we have really addressed all of those things. We tracked down the publications. Interestingly enough, ODF&W and Vanessa Petro would never officially tell us where they got that piece of information. So we have this much more robust petition, and which comes with a very extensive set of publications. And what was beautiful about the timing of Emily's publication is while we talked about the values of wetlands in our June 12th request, when it came time to submit, we now could cite a couple of, we cited her earlier stuff as well, but we had that really nice 2020 publication. So where we stand right now, we submitted on the 24th of September, and at that point, it begins a 90-day clock at which the commission is they are required by law to decide 2 things. One is, are they going to deny the petition outright, which they have the ability to do. The other one is are they going to vote to initiate the process of rulemaking? So it's not a yes on the petition or a no on the petition. In June, it was a yes or no. That's what we were hoping for because we were in the middle of the open season in terms of trapping regulations. Now it's they can deny outright, or they can turn around and what they do is they basically say, okay, we are going to vote to consider the petition. And at that point in time, there is public outreach, there's public discussion, there's all those kinds of things. So on November 13th is the day that we go before the commission at that point in time. That's the day that there will be a panel, there will be some testimony, and at the end of that session, it's pretty much going to be devoted strictly to the petition. They have to make a vote. Either they say, nope, we're going to deny the petition, or they say, we're going to initiate rulemaking. And then that just begins a process of public engagement. It's uncertain about how long that process can take. So that's kind of where we are right now. And if they vote no, there's always a couple of other options. What we're really hoping, though, is that that they realize is that even if we were not to end up with all of federally managed public lands, that if, a commissioner says, well, I could see in some cases where it might be valuable, like if you're doing a big restoration project, that at that point that they will say, well, I can think of some reasons why it might be a good thing, so we'll open the discussion. And then at that point, the public is going to really have to start weighing in. We think, that if we're going to be ecologically having any kind of a meaningful, if people are going to be able to do like real landscape work, then we need it on a big scale. We need it to be federally managed public lands. We all know that it needs to be more, but that is the minimum ecological size that we feel. And what it does is it allows pretty much most counties to over time reap some benefits. One of the things that is obviously, a big deal, trapping does have a huge effect on population numbers. So even if you take out one beaver out of a colony, if it's your pregnant female, you are set back. Or if you take out the 2 kits who were just about ready to head off on their own and build some beaver ponds, you're starting over again. So there's going to be a lag. And so it becomes very important that we get this started as soon as possible. And as Emily's talk really shows, is that they've got to build the dams, they've got to create the elevated water tables, they've got to create their channels out there and stuff like that. And all of that takes time. And every time you take beavers out, you set yourself back. So what we don't know at this point is how much engagement we want the public yet. Like, we don't know if we want, okay, start sending we're in support of this or whatever, or if we need to wait on that. And what I'd like to suggest, Michael, is that I'm going to keep you posted. We're starting to figure it out. You know, we're starting to figure out what's our strategy and get a sense from commissioners, like, do we want to do a full court press by the public, or do we not? If suddenly we hear that the trappers and the hunters are doing a full court press, that this is a bad idea, just deny the petition outright. At that point in time, we'll need a full court press from public back. So at this point, we have 1 month to prepare and to figure out what our strategy is and how it's going to be. So that's kind of where it is. I'll keep Michael updated. If we decide we need a full court press, we'll be asking for press releases to go out to, alerts to go out to members. I think that one of the things that with the fires that we just had on the west side, as the alert is really going to ask, in my mind, we'll be asking the commissioners to say, we've got to talk about this. The science is showing us this really amazing thing. People lost their homes, people lost, their livelihood, wildlife lost, fish lost. We have to talk about this. And, so we'll have a better sense of sort of where we want the public to really start to go in on.
Great, thanks, Suzanne. So did I hear you say the next time that we can expect to hear from the commission about what direction they're going to take with this petition is at the November meeting? And could you share what that date was again?
Yes, the November meeting is November 13th. And based on, we had a Zoom call yesterday, and at that meeting, they have to vote one way or the other. So they had 90 days. They could have considered the petition over 90 days, and on the 89th day said, okay, now we're going to talk about it. They've decided to make that decision much sooner. And part of that has to do with the December 13th already had a lot of things on the agenda. So they initially weren't going to have a November meeting. They're going to. So yeah, November 13th, we will know at the end of that meeting if it is a yes vote to initiate rulemaking. I wish it was a yes vote to just accept the petition, but it's just a yes vote to initiate, or nope, we're going to deny the petition. So the 13th of November.
Great.
Yeah.
I know that there was a previous time that we talked that we were talking a little bit about maybe letters to the editor being a strategy, sort of to get this issue more on people's radar, without directly pressuring the commission while they're kind of in this deciding phase. It seems like with the wildfires and, Emily's paper that is getting traction, this might be a really great topic for people to, write letters to their local newspaper and talk a little bit about this research that's happening and the petition. I think that would be
I think letters to the editor talking about, hey, we just got through this wildfire. Here's what we're learning beavers can do about helping us sort of fireproof our landscapes. What does that mean for communities? What does that mean for our fish, our wildlife, our livestock? I think that would be amazing. The research is really exciting. The pictures are really compelling. And, there's just something, and one of the beauties, and I hope Emily continues to look at more and more fires, one of the beauties is that, you look at these fires with different types of vegetation types, and the story's the same. You look at it at different states, the story's the same. Now, is that news to any of us who kind of get clued into beavers early? No. We're all like, yeah, beavers do what beavers do, and it doesn't really matter whether you're in New York or in California or in Oregon. We all get that. But if you're looking for a reason to say, well, Oregon is different, we're lucky enough that one of the fires that Emily looked at is in Oregon. And so, we have that. So yeah, I think that that's really that could be a real possibility about just talking about the value of beavers and what does it mean in terms of restoration and how do we jumpstart restoration. But here is your catch-22 again. Currently, beaver trapping is permitted in most of Oregon. So if you've got a beaver who moves in, beaver family that moves in and starts building dams and wetlands, and November 15th, beaver trapping season starts, and it goes through March 15th. So you could have the most incredible set of beaver dams in place, and on December 25th, Christmas Day, somebody decides they want to go out and take those beavers out, and that's it. And then come springtime, those dams maybe blow out and you start all over again. So this is why the trapping becomes such an important thing, because the benefits that we know as far as salmon, as far as wildfire, as far as water and stream temperatures, none of those can happen if you keep taking beavers out. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. You know, the 13th, they make the decision, and the 15th of November, beaver trapping season opens.
Yeah, quick turnaround there.
Yeah, and unfortunately, while it is, if they vote yes to initiate rulemaking, which means, okay, we're going to start the process, that process can be going on at the same time people are trapping. And so, you know, until trapping is closed, you know, we can expect that there's going to be this very weird disconnect between what Emily shows and what a lot of other research shows in terms of their benefits and what people are doing. Let's see. If they vote yes, okay. If they vote yes, our trapper is going to create a fur desert in the intervening time. I'll be honest, I'm worried about that. Because they're going to have a period of time in which they can continue to trap even as the public is having the conversation. And that may be where the public input starts to become I will in just a second, Sally. That might be where the public input starts to really matter. It's like, okay, they voted yes to initiate. We've just had these big fires. And then to really raise the question, okay, so this whole time we're having this conversation, people are out there trapping beavers. Talk about a bizarre sort of disconnect. And that may be a really important thing to talk about. And also to talk about stuff like, so what's our responsibility? I mean, if people are taking out the one thing that might help fireproof the landscape, do they have any responsibility, fiscal responsibility for the next fire? I mean, do we need to start, and do the commissioners have a fiscal responsibility to pay for damages when you are preventing a species from doing its incredible work? I mean, I think these are questions that, like, what is accountability? So yes, I do worry about that. I actually am worried about that a lot. We know with the timber wars is that when they were going, when the Northwest Forest Plan was going to go in, timber harvest ramped up. As far as Sally's question, okay, so what they're deciding on, they're deciding on, we're going to deny the petition outright. We're not going to talk about it. It's done. We, the commission, have decided we are not even going to consider it. And they have the right to do that. That's one option they can vote on. No, we will not take the petition under consideration. The second one, and it's the one that we hope for, is that they say, we realize this is important enough and we need to have the public discussion and really start thinking about this. We are voting yes to initiate the process to consider the petition. So it's not a yes vote on the petition. So when the final vote comes down, maybe only some areas are closed to beaver trapping. If we're back to only some areas are closed to beaver trapping, we are going to find ourselves again in that same place of only some communities, some species are going to benefit rather than everybody. So hopefully if that didn't answer your question, I'll try it again. But yeah, unfortunately, it's a no, we're not going to talk about it, or yes, we will start to have the discussion.
Great, thank you. So it looks like there was a comment about appealing to hunters and fishers. And Emily, it looks like you followed up with that question, talking about a podcast you were recently on. Do you want to speak any more about your experience with those types of folks?
Sure. When I got the request, I did a lot of Googling to make sure I knew what audience was reaching out to me. And it was for Artemis, which is a sub-branch of the National Wildlife Federation. And it's women hunters and anglers. And I was asking, what's your interest in beavers? Like, what's the goal here? And they're like, oh, we started this huge citizen science project monitoring beaver dams because they make such great trout habitat and duck habitat. And like, that's what we want to go get. Like the group that I talked to is really focused on sort of a hunt to eat mentality, not a like fur-bearing situation mentality. And they were great, and they loved the podcast, and it got lots of views, and I got lots of follow-up questions from people, and they were like, wow, how do I need to be really careful around the lodge? Will I scare away the beavers if I'm out there like trying to angle? And it was cool. It was a totally different audience I hadn't really talked to before. I'm really glad that they reached out. The science they're doing is great. They're really monitoring a ton of beaver dams. Actually, most of them are in like Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. So they're really, trying to figure out what the situation is with beavers, and their own experience has informed them. Like they go to these beaver ponds and it's full fish, or there's like 150,000 ducks on it. And in duck season, that's great. Just leave the beavers alone, because as soon as you get out of those areas, you're back on these incised streams, no ducks, no fish, no fun. And I think it's great because these people, they're like kind of the bridge into the broader hunter community, which I'm not personally part of. And it was good for me to sort of feel like through the grapevine, the beaver message was getting out there. Like, these creatures are making habitat. Do you want to go hunt deer? They're making habitat for deer. Do you want to go fish for trout, salmon? They're making habitat for those too. Like, you can have so many other species if you just leave the beavers alone.
I just want to add into something that Emily said, and this is interesting, and I'd love to get the name of these women if it comes time to that. Because when we did our request, our official request, in June, when we were just asking, so it's not the petition, which is a much more legal, formal document. Oregon Hunters Association came out in opposition. The Wildlife Society came out in opposition. And granted, the individuals that chose to speak that were from the Oregon Hunters Association and the Wildlife Society, they don't necessarily represent everybody, but they spoke on behalf of their organizations. Now, we also had the Steamboat Stealers, which is a fishing group that came out in support of the request for beavers. Obviously, they, as fishers, the conservation anglers came out in support. They're one of the petitioners. The conservation angler is one of the petitioners. So it's an interesting mix, but I'm really intrigued by these women. And that is a great slogan. So that would be, the possibility of getting them to say, this is what we're saying, and this has got some real value, could be very important in swaying some of the commissioners.
When I've gotten people nervous about beavers, in my experience, and obviously I think people do talk to me about it differently, given that it's like the entire focus of my research. They come in with a little bit of a bias there. But what I've heard from people who are with these orgs that do come out vocally opposed is that the fear isn't as much about the beavers themselves. It's about like, well, does this mean we're not going to be able to hunt ducks? Like, where does it stop? And so when I try to talk about it, I try to make it clear, like, we've got a boatload of ducks. Ducks are not a keystone species. We can spare a few ducks. Like, I'm not coming for your ducks. This is just beavers, like a limited message. And I think that is a really great strategy when you're talking to people, is just remind them, like, I'm not going to stop everything and just say, like, we're all vegans for the rest of eternity. Like, I'm here to say, let's protect beavers.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. I think though that the other thing too is that we are this concept of a species that actually has value, really intrinsic, essential value, is something that people struggle with, because what we heard a lot of was, well, I enjoy trapping them. And so that whole sense of, yeah, but you're taking away my fun. And so that's a really different thing. And also this idea of, surely they can't be that important. I mean, surely they just aren't that big of a deal. They're just a friggin' rodent. So I think that so some of that is, oh, you're gonna come and now then we're not gonna hunt. And it's like, wow, you know, even if you read the petition or the request, it was like hunting and recreation opportunities go up, fish habitat goes up. So it's part of that, but I think sometimes that masks this idea of that we have to consider another species besides our just individual fun. And the number of people who actually trap commercially and recreationally that submit to ODF&W is less than 164 people in the state. So yeah, but they have a contingency. So, you know, these women who are like, whoa, wait, we're seeing some pretty awesome things. It's pretty neat.
People really tend to go to extremes there. Let's see, we only have a few minutes left. I want to make sure that folks, if you have questions, you can just throw those in the chat. Looks like we have one. Could the commission possibly vote yes to consider the petition and place a temporary ban while they consider it? Not that they would, but could they?
That's a great question. And we're exploring if that's an option. Now, I'm going to tell you, we're not even going to ask for that. But it would be really awesome if they came to that conclusion on their own. I think what our focus is this. We have one goal. We want them to vote yes to consider. And as much as I like what you suggested, and we talked about that, you know, how do we get some of these folks who are, you know, inclined to just go no, to say yes? It's just like we have this really narrow focus. We want you to say you'll talk about it, that the public now can engage, and we'll do all the process stuff to make it happen. It does make sense that if you are going to vote yes to consider, but you're talking 2 days before trapping season opens up. And that's probably unrealistic. But who knows? You know, that gets back to the question of, could we just have massive numbers of beavers killed this year?
Well, so with the few minutes we have left here, I wanted to ask both of you, you know, BARC is working to put some more resources up on our website and share some resources out via social media about both the beaver trapping ban and about this relationship between wildfire and beaver. I was wondering if each of you maybe just take a second, could direct people to maybe some of the best resources that you would recommend that people explore if they want to educate maybe their friends about some of these efforts and some of these new findings. That'd be really great. It looks like Emily did in the chat a ways up share a link to the Smokey the Beaver study. So thanks for doing that.
What I probably would say is, I believe you have it, Michael, which is the press release with the link. If not, I can resend that out to everybody. The petition is incredibly robust. So in there are photographs of beavers moving in and how that changes. There is an incredible bibliography. There is discussions about habitat availability and the studies that exist out there where trapping has stopped and what's been the response to beavers. So to me, that may be one place to go where you could go look and say, I'm interested in ducks, and there's probably a couple references related to that. Emily's work, of course, is cited as well. So anyway, that would probably be, and if folks are interested, I'll just resend that press release because I don't think I can link it in here. Can I? Can I link a press release?
I just found a version of it.
That's it.
I think that's the one.
Yep. If you go there, embedded in that is a link, and that link will take you to the petition. In addition, if you, what's not in that is the bibliography. I mean, the thing is cited, all the citations are in there, but I also did afterwards a bibliography, and every single publication that we cited in there, we have an electronic version on. So I'm going to forward that to Michael, because I don't know how to do these links, and I think the link would be just to my computer. I'll send that to Michael. He can post that. If you see something in there, a paper, and you can't easily get it by just Googling, just send me an email to my email address, and I can send you that electronic copy if you can't get it. Some of them might be a little tough to get. But I would be happy to share, you know, anything that we've got to date. And yeah, Michael, when we get off, I'll send you that bibliography. And that bibliography is specifically tied to what we cited in the petition. So it's different than the bibliography, which was one of our appendices. The other thing too, I would really strongly suggest folks go to, especially if they start to think about writing letters to the editor, is Appendix F. It's the economics section. And the economics of beaver-created habitat will blow your mind. We are talking about hundreds of millions and billions of dollars of services. So we had a guy who does economics, natural resource economics, and he is the lead author on this. And so that, you know, if you're looking at why bother, if money is the only thing you cared about, it's, you know, it's pretty well spelled out. So yeah.
Then for my updates, I post on my Twitter a lot. It's all science, it's all beavs all day. And I retweet people's science about beavers. I follow like 1,000 beaver people. I don't know if there's actually that many, but I follow all the beaver people and they do a cool study and I'm like, look at this cool study. So if you want to see someone commenting on it in real time, my Twitter's there for you. You can just block all the other garbage that comes streaming through Twitter. And then I also keep my website somewhat up to date. It's emilyfairfaxscience.com. I can drop the link into the chat. There's some brief summaries of the research I've done on there, as well as links to my papers. I did see a question come in for me about tips on IDing beaver dams from satellite photos. Yeah, I train students on it all the time. There's specific things you look for, large ponded areas that have like a very defined but kind of wiggly edge, and then a really diffuse edge on the other side. And if you want to practice finding them, usually you start with like aerial photos or like looking out the airplane window when airplane travel was a thing. And like you can see beaver dams, and then, you know, scale that up to satellite images and they're a little fuzzier, but you can still see them. Then you can't stop seeing them. Every time you fly over mountains, you're like, where are the dams? I'm sure they're here. The person in the seat next to you is like, I don't like this girl, she's weird. Not that that's a personal experience or anything, but if you ever like want to learn more about it, you can always shoot me an email. I'm happy to explain it in a bit more detail. It's fun.
I just want to thank you, Emily and Suzanne, for attending this talk and sharing everything that you shared, and also for everyone else who showed up and asked really good questions and shared some thoughts. I really learned a lot, and I'm just super excited now, even more than ever, to learn more about, you know, what the effects of the fire were, you know, the results of this trapping ban. And yeah, I just want to end by, just encouraging folks, you know, check out the BARC website. It's bark-out.org. We have some upcoming events, including at the end of this month, we're having an in-person wetlands habitat survey training. So that's pre-registration is required for that. And we'll be following all the COVID protocols and all that. And lots of other stuff too, if you check our Facebook page. Looks like Suzanne, you had one more thing to add.
I just have one more thing. Folks, as you're thinking about this petition, start thinking about how to reframe it in the positive. This is not a beaver ban. This is a hopeful climate change, drought, wildfire restoration strategy that costs nothing. Start framing it in that way, as opposed to something we're taking away, as opposed to something that we in fact are going to be receiving. So really start driving that home. You know, the petition to begin statewide restoration that prepares us for climate change, wildfire, and drought. Statewide restoration that addresses our declining salmon. Statewide restoration that helps our farmers. That's what this petition is about. Closing trapping is how we're going to get there. But the goal of the petition is the restoration at the large scale. Okay, I'm done.
Thanks for that, Suzanne. And yeah, we're going to be following up with people who attended this and sharing out all these links, since there's so many great links popping into the chat. Also, a recording of this meeting. So thank you all again, and we will see you next time. Until then, Beaver on.